Overall, I was really impressed with the quality of care that I received in giving birth to my son. One thing that I think could have been done differently is the way in which the nurses navigated me struggling slightly with breastfeeding to begin with. And essentially at one point I was told, you might be discharged, but we don't have to discharge your baby until we think that he's ready to go home. And as a new mom, that was terrifying to hear. So let me back up a little bit and explain what happened. After my husband and I left the recovery room, we were taken to our private suite. It was amazing. I was so blown away by the room that we were given. We had a private space. There was a board on the wall that had the name of our nurse on duty, the secondary nurse. We had a phone number for a lactation consultant to come to our room. We had so much support. I have always known that breastfeeding is something that I wanted to try. If you follow me, you know that I've talked about saying, oh, I really hope it works. I really hope that I can do it. And so when my son was born, one piece of advice that I was given by a lactation consultant that I'd hired to work with me after birth, so she was not in the hospital, was to try and latch him as frequently as possible. And latching is basically getting him to get on my boob and stay there and drink, basically. First 24 hours, probably the first few hours, not even the full 24, but I was trying to latch him myself. And while I had watched videos on it, while I kind of in principle knew what it might look like, I've never seen someone really breastfeed or latch a baby. And I think this is one of the things that's so difficult as in motherhood nowadays, is that we're doing things that are not common knowledge anymore. At least for me, it's just not something that I've seen many women do. So I'm trying to figure this out for myself. And to the credit of the hospital, I ended up in a position where I had two nurses next to me. They'd called the lactation consultant. The lactation consultant wasn't able to get to me until later on in the evening, but I had so many nurses around me trying to help me latch him, and they were literally grabbing my boob, grabbing his head, and trying to do the right kind of protocol to get that to happen. The problem was that he was latching for maybe 1 or 2 seconds, and then he was unlatching, which was not what you want, right? You want them to latch and be able to stay on, and of course there's an element that he was less than a day old. There was a lot of things at play, but the one win of that first day was that I saw my colostrum come in for the first time. One thing that I never knew about breastfeeding was that there's kind of 3 phases to breast milk. Google this if you want the technical terms for everything, but I'm just going to give you my abridged version. There's colostrum, which is like a sticky honey type substance when your milk is just starting to kind of come out. Then there's kind of an in-between milk between colostrum and full milk. And then a few days after birth, your milk will come in, and that's when you are kind of fully producing milk. So the fact that I saw my colostrum come in was amazing because it's something that I never thought my body could do. So it was really, really cool to see that. But of course it was frustrating and so hard that my son was not latching. Later on that night, we had a lactation consultant come in, and when she saw my son and she saw me, she basically said there were 2 things going on. First, my son had a tongue tie. When a baby is feeding, they need their movement of tongue to be able to create the motion to get the milk. He was not able to do that because of his tongue tie. And at the same time, I had never thought about this before, but apparently I have quite short nipples. I had never thought about this before. So if I had my time again, I would definitely recommend people investigate nipples and the roles that they play in breastfeeding, and just try and think in advance about how your unique nipples might play into this situation. I didn't even think about it. I just went with the flow, which, again, you live and you learn. With that in mind, she said, you might want to consider pumping and giving him a bottle, or introducing some formula and giving him a bottle. And for me, I was like, he's a day old. We're so new to this. Let's just see how it goes, and let's give him a chance to kind of figure it out. That night, alongside one of the nurses called Clara, who was the most wonderful woman. I can't thank her enough for everything she did for me. We stayed up late into the night, basically hand expressing colostrum, which basically means squeezing my boob to try and get the colostrum out, put it into a syringe, put it into a cup to collect, to then feed to my son. And this is painstakingly time consuming. When I tell you, I've never cherished something more than I cherished that colostrum. I kept thinking to myself, oh my gosh, if that little thing knocks over, I might cry, because it took maybe an hour to get a milliliter of it. It was so time consuming and not for much fruit of the labor. So it was so hard. Next day, it was basically more of the same. My son wasn't latching. My milk was still not really coming through. And it's based on supply and demand, right? So when your baby's sucking on you, your body says, okay, create more. But because I wasn't really having much sucking going on, my body was just staying in that colostrum phase, which was just making it so hard for me to get anything out. At this point, Clara, the nurse that I loved, recommended that I start considering pumping. And not that it's the end of the world. I think it's a very personal thing. I just always wanted to breastfeed. When they weighed my son, he had fallen in weight from 7.1 pounds to 6.8, I want to say. And I knew that this was within the range of what's to be expected in the first week. This was one thing that, I'm so grateful that I had this knowledge to hand, to know that this was not an abnormal amount of weight to lose in the first, day of life for a newborn. But because this was kind of the trajectory that he was on, the nurses started saying, you might want to consider pumping. And at first I shut that idea down. I was like, guys, I don't want to pump. Thank you so much. It's just not something that I want to do. I'm going to keep hand express until we can fix his tongue tie and figure out a solution to the problem that's going on. Now, this day we had a different lactation consultant, and when she came in and saw me, she essentially said, look, at this stage, my recommendation is that we introduce some formula to you just to get things going. I was like, I'm open to it, but only if it is the last thing for me to try. I want to see how we go. I'm hand expressing. And that was that. Later that day, I had a different nurse. My Clara had gone home. I had a different nurse who was with me, and she also was lovely, but she really gave me some tough love. She essentially said, look, you have one of the best lactation consultants in the hospital looking at you, advising you to take formula, even if you take it as like an interim step, to take it, and you're not listening to her. You may be discharged tomorrow, but we don't have to discharge your baby. And what are you going to do then? And so I was kind of like, okay, thank you for that. But that definitely hit home and put the fear of life into me, if I'm being honest. This conversation happened as this nurse was leaving and Clara was swapping back in. So this was kind of towards the evening that this was going on. When she left, the lactation consultant came back in and I said, look, what do I have to do to get him fed without me having to use formula or to use a bottle? And she said, well, you can pump to try and bring your milk in, and then we can syringe feed him so he doesn't get used to the bottle. And I was like, great, let's do that. The problem was that I was pumping and honestly, nothing really was coming out. It felt like a waste of time to me. I think I also didn't fully understand the idea of supply and demand around like the more I pump, the more my body will produce. So the lactation consultant came in and she said, look, here's what I recommend. I suggest that twice tonight you do 10 minutes on, 10 minutes off of pumping for an hour. So I started doing this and I was like, I'm just going to keep pumping and try and get my milk in. It's going to be great. I actually had a pretty good energy considering the situation. When Clara came back on duty, she was like, honestly, Liz, if I were you, I would pump for 30 minutes and then wait like 2 hours and then pump for 30 minutes and then wait for 2 hours. And it's worth saying it's not just about the pumping. It's also about pumping and feeding it to my son, which as a side note, it's not just, feeding it to him a bottle because we didn't want to do that. It's taking a 1 milliliter syringe, pulling the syringe out and putting my finger in his mouth so he'd suckle, and then putting the milk in via syringe. The reason for this is so that he's practicing the motion of sucking and learning, okay, when I suck, I get milk. This felt like a good way of kind of sticking with my breastfeeding journey and just helping him gain weight and helping my supply come in. So my husband and I made a plan. I have to give him so much props. I think it's the best example of teamwork in our relationship ever. What we did was we set an alarm throughout the night. I set the alarm for an hour and a half at a time. I would wake up, I'd pump for half an hour, I'd then wake him up to help me feed our son. I would then go straight to sleep, set an alarm for an hour and a half's time. My husband would then clean all of the pumping parts and do all the cleaning up, burp the baby, put the baby back down to bed. And then I would wake up in an hour and a half and pump again for half an hour, and we would do that. And we just did that throughout the night. We did it nonstop. The frustrating thing was I kept asking the nurses, what are the criteria that we need to meet to be able to leave? And they could not tell me what the metric of success was. I was like, is it stopping the weight decreasing? Like what do I need to show you so I can leave? Being told by someone, your son right now belongs to the state and does not belong to you, is not a fun time. And yet there was no clear guidance around like, where's the goalpost? What are we aiming for here? My husband and I just kept pumping every hour and a half. I didn't even do it twice. I did it as much as I could. Like every hour and a half I was pumping and feeding my son, just trying to help him gain weight. On that last day, the lactation consultant at the hospital recommended that we try a nipple shield. And this is something that my lactation consultant at home had recommended on the first day, and they had told me no. This lactation consultant at the hospital said, let's try the nipple shield. It'll make it easier for him to latch, just to tide you over until you can figure this out later on. And on the last day in hospital, I finally got him to latch, and I called the nurse over and I was like, is he drinking? And when she confirmed that he had latched and he'd been there for like 20 minutes, I just started crying, and I was just so happy and relieved that we'd kind of reached the end of this odyssey of just not a good time. Finally, when they did the weigh-in, they said they were happy for him to come home, but it was not easy at all. And it was terrifying. It was so terrifying to be told, you can go home, but your son might not be able to go home tomorrow unless you give him formula. It's all coming together, but it's definitely been a journey to get here. That has been my experience with breastfeeding so far. We're just at the beginning, but that first hurdle was a big hurdle. And I hope this helps someone else in preparing to go for hospital if you want to breastfeed, in thinking about the challenges you might face in breastfeeding. Bit of an all-around story, but I'm sleep deprived. I hope that helps. Let me know if you have any questions. And here's to all the parents who are trying to feed their children, because it is rough out here, I gotta say, from personal experience.